welcome to today's fireside chat. I'm your host, Minling, and we are so excited to have Sebastian here with us today to talk about purpose, money, and consciousness. But before we do that, before we dive into the fireside chat, I want to quickly share a little bit about the Grateful Giraffes for those of you that are not a giraffe and are watching on YouTube. So the Grateful Giraffes are a vibrant community of over 800 members who value gratitude, wellness, and impact. We're both spiritual and grounded at the same time. We co-create meaningful experiences like our biohacking safari and other events around, mostly around LA right now. And we're also building a community-owned lifestyle brand dedicated to human flourishing. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch other fireside chats, or if you're interested in learning more about the Grateful Giraffes, you can go to gratefulgiraffes.com. So today's fireside chat is with Sebastian Naum, and Sebastian is a multifaceted, bilingual, bicultural entrepreneur. He owns two marketing agencies that specialize in digital marketing and international business development. He's also the host of his podcast, Profits Unfiltered, where he interviews international leaders and entrepreneurs about his passion for conscious capitalism. He serves on the board of directors for Conscious Capitalism Los Angeles, and through his content and public speaking, he educates his listeners on all things marketing and inspires people around the world to implement purpose into their profit models. So I'm so excited to have you here, Sebastian. We are excited to learn from you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Minling and Grateful Giraffes. What's up, everyone?
Yes. And I would love for you to share a little bit about your journey and how you got into conscious capitalism and conscious profits and the business
Yeah,
world.
yeah, absolutely. I've had a digital marketing agency for a very long time now, and what I realized is that I loved the fact that it was remote. I got to work what I wanted. It was bringing in money and all these things, but I felt very like just sort of like blah about it. And it was like, why am I not excited about life? Why am I not excited about work and things like that? And I started realizing that sometimes during work, I was actually excited. And I was like, okay, I'm trying, what is the difference? Like, why is it some days or some days not? Or why is it some clients? Is it the clients? And then I started realizing, I was like, oh, it's actually the clients and the people and the companies and the movements that I'm helping grow. If I'm helping a company grow that's just there to make money and to sell its products, it was like, I was very turned off by that. And if it was a company or a product that had a greater impact in the world or for community or for people or for society, and there was purpose into that company, that's when I was like, oh, this is really interesting to me. So I started kind of having some conversations around just sort of like the workspace with people about it. And somebody was like, oh, this is a thing. This is called conscious capitalism. And I was like, what? And so I read a book about it and I attended some events and I was like, wow, there's this whole world about companies that really do care about their profits. And it's not the nonprofit world. It is, hey, let's make money, but also create impact out of it. So the more we can scale by making money, the more the impact we can scale. And that's sort of where I sort of like this light bulb went off of like, wow, there's this whole world that I actually really care about. How can I be more involved with this? And also, how can I mix my own business into it?
I love that because, as we, build businesses, I know there's a lot of entrepreneurs on here and people are building their business. We want to make it mean something. We want to make an impact. We just don't want to make more money, but we want to make a difference as well too. And I would love for you to share a little bit about, businesses are usually measured by revenue and growth, but how do you define success in a conscious business? And how does somebody start to transition and think about that as they're growing their business inside of the space?
Yeah, each business on its own can have its own way of measuring success, right? So ultimately, one thing that I think it is important to consider is that if we just take all of these sort of non-money related measures to measure success and we forget about sort of the money aspect of it, then you may have a business that doesn't flourish, that doesn't have profit, and that ultimately all these beautiful sort of impact related things that you have don't really matter anymore, because if the business isn't running, then all of your impact can't be running either. So I always do like to remind like people, like, it is still a business, right? So it's very important to have that sort of like the ROI and profit as an important, a very important thing that's going to measure the success of your business, so that all of these other aspects can also be measured and matter, right? So but yeah, ultimately there's so many different ways. It depends on what that impact is. If you are a company that really cares about sustainability, it's very much an eco-conscious company, then you may have your own measures, whether it has to do with like emissions or whether it has to do with the type of packaging that it's using and how much plastic it's saving. So it really just depends sort of on what this other impact related mission is of your business that you can measure. But it even goes further than that. It even goes into sort of like the culture of the business, right? How do people feel about working in your company? That could even go into like turnover, right? So there are very many businesses out there that are very much conscious, quote unquote businesses or impact forward businesses that have very, very little turnover because of the conscious culture of the company, because of how involved they are with the mission and how much they love working for this company. So then turnover is really low. And that now all of a sudden becomes a measurable of essentially the consciousness of the culture of the company based on its impact and mission. So it's a little bit of, I'll give you this sort of roundabout answer, but there's so many different ways to potentially measure something besides its ROI. But as I said, it's important to still keep that as an important measure so that the impact can continue to go up.
That's a good point. It's really also really personal to like the impact that you're making. And I know I've worked in the corporate world for a long time before I transitioned to my own business. And a lot of those corporate companies were just slapping on impact, like or
Yeah.
Susan Pullman, or like they were trying to add something as an afterthought. Like, how do you feel like a business should create their impact, and how do you spread that vision from within? Because as you mentioned, it's also very culturally based too. You can't really do it as an afterthought. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Thanks, Minling. Yeah, that's a great question, Minling. So one of the first things you touched on there was greenwashing, right? So uh, essentially, businesses know that, for example, sustainability is good for business. Like there's just proof, right? I believe it's something like 21%, or excuse me, companies that implement eco-conscious practices make 21% more profit than businesses that don't, right? So that's very much well known across, brands and companies. Implement some sort of eco-conscious movement in it, and you're going to make more money. And so with all of that comes all of these businesses, like you said, that are just slapping things on, right? So it comes greenwashing. Now, there's been studies that are showing that consumers are trusting brands less than ever. So it's something like 61% of consumers are having trouble trusting brands based on the claims that they're making about some sort of sustainability aspect or eco-consciousness and things like that. So sort of going back to your original question is, how do you get this? It has to be really the mission has to be so truly embedded genuinely into the DNA of the brand. It's tough to sort of slap something on after the fact. Ideally, it's something that's how the brand or company started, with this big mission to, generate X impact along with this business model that they have. That's sort of the ideal world, because then it's there from the beginning. Anyone that they're hiring from the get-go is already in that. They're believing in it. It's like the religion of the company, and it's going to be embedded, and everyone's going to believe it. It's going to be very sincere, right? As opposed to just, like you said, slapping something on later. So if your company has no choice but to do that, because maybe it didn't start that way, but they truly genuinely want to do that, then it becomes this whole thing of, okay, how do we really change the ethos of the company? Like you kind of have to go through like an entire rebrand, truly, which is something that, for example, like at my agency at Go Global, we've worked a lot with brands of like rebranding, but not just rebranding a logo or colors or fonts. You're rebranding sort of the essence of the brand and the ethos and the mission. And then you have to go out and story tell in so many different ways to make sure that you're doing it genuinely.
That's a good point. It has to come from within, like truly has to be the heartbeat of the company. And like you said, it's not, too late if you started a company and then you decided like, hey, this is an area we're passionate about and we want to add this into our mission and needing to rebrand. Let's talk a little bit about like marketing because there's both internal and external marketing to create the movement, right? To create the belief, to create the culture, to create people's passion for the cause. So how do you approach, both internal and external marketing of your mission so that it is more aligned to that impact focused area that you want to move forward with?
Yeah, that's another good question, Minling. So, starting with what you said about internally, so a company or brand or movement, organization, it has to start with conscious leadership, right? So it has to start from the top, or whether or not you see it as top to bottom, or it's not necessarily organized that way, it's got to have some form of conscious leadership, right? Whether that is one person or a group of people that have to really be passionate and believe in that mission. If leaders or a leader is that way, then people that are working for that person are already going to see it as genuinely, right? You typically, it's tough to see some sort of a movement where everybody in the movement is sort of like egging each other on and just like sort of naturally. It typically has to happen with a conscious leader that's really bleeding that passion outwardly. So that it internally, I believe that that's one of the most important things. There's tons of other things and how that can be carried out, but I believe it starts with that, and that's probably the most important thing. And then externally it really, really, really comes down to storytelling. And right nowadays, there are so many different ways to storytell. Of course, we have so many different platforms, whether that is, different social media platforms. I think you kind of have to find your best way to tell that story. For example, like Grateful Giraffes, right, is very much a community forward, in person, through events, through parties, through these sorts of gatherings and things like that. So the storytelling is happening a lot from word of mouth. And that's a beautiful thing because I think that that's actually one of the most powerful ways, no matter what. But whatever platform you're doing it on, it has to be through storytelling because humans connect with stories and analogies better than with anything else, right? So, one of the biggest things that in marketing and branding, sort of you say that marketing is what you tell others about yourself. So whether you're a person or a company or a brand. If I'm marketing, it's this is who I am. This is what we're about. Branding is what others are saying about you, right? And so you can't go out and tell everybody what your branding is. Like you can sort of create it, right? You create it and then you go out and storytell and you market. And then branding is going to be sort of how people see you. So you have to tell those stories about the impact, about the mission. You have to showcase it. You have to, show those results. You have to tell the ins and outs. I think you have to be also very transparent. I think transparency and sincerity are huge, right? You can, even as a brand or company, you can show things that sort of went wrong in the past for you, or how you may have struggled, or something that you had to change. And I think that transparency really bleeds through, and it generates a lot of trust. And then people on the outside start to really see that you're real and that your mission is real.
I love what you said about the transparency and just really sharing what is real and the perspective that marketing is what you're telling people, and then like the brand is like reflecting back. I don't think I've heard it in that way, and it's really a really good way to think about things. I want to go back to the storytelling and like how do you storytell effectively? Because some people here might be like newer to like marketing. How do you get it across like what your message is and your mission that you have? Because it's getting harder to break through. It's getting harder because there's so many areas or places that you can market, but there's a lot of noise. So how do you like start to break through the noise to be able to tell your story and have it stick with people?
Yeah, that's a great question. Truly, it comes down to ultimately getting to people's emotions, right? Because First of all, it's rare. We think we're buying things or buying into things with our brains and our rationality, but it's really not. It kind of comes down to our hearts and our emotions, right? So, in the way I'm saying it, it may come off as like, oh, you're sort of like you're just trying to get to my emotions, and you're sort of like cheating your way into making me buy something. That's not the point. Your question was how we tell these stories. You tell the stories through emotions, right? And so whether that is through humor or something that's really touching somebody's core feelings of depth about, what is it, family? Is it the environment? Is it some sort of a connection? You have to get to people's emotions, right? So you're right. There's tons and tons of noise, but ultimately, you can choose a style of storytelling or multiple styles of storytelling, but you have to figure out ways to get people to stop scrolling, right? And start listening. So you have to start out your storytelling with some form of a hook or a ramp, right? So that's even in public speaking, that's a thing, right? So when I start doing a talk, whether it's a short or small talk or big talk or whatever, I never start out by saying, hello, everyone. My name is Sebastian. Thank you for coming, blah, blah, blah. Just so you know, the restrooms over here. And like never start out like that, right? So you want to start out with a strong ramp, with some sort of like a big stat or something shocking or a story or something funny. So it's the same. So when you're storytelling, when you're giving a talk, when you're getting people to stop on social media, it's give them some impact right away, and then tell a story that somehow hits the heartstrings and emotions, and that's really how you're going to connect.
What's up, guys? I hope you're enjoying the show. If you love the show, please share it with a homie. It would mean the world to me. Also want to let you know that you can check out sebastiannaum.com for more resources like this, and also www.goglobal.agency, a digital marketing agency that's end-to-end, helping purpose-driven and mission-driven brands scale their impact. Again, that's goglobal.agency or sebastiannaum.com. Please hit me up straight up on Instagram, DM me, ask me questions. I'd love to connect with you and see what you thought about this episode or other episodes and what you want to hear more of. Much love.
That is really about that hook. It's like it's finding your angle about things so that it gets people's attention. I would love to go into this part about, finding your purpose, or finding like that impact, like and to it on a deeper level. Because I think some people, when they start with businesses, sometimes they start with like a purpose and they might get disconnected over time, or they find that what they aligned originally isn't quite exactly what they want to align with, and their ideas might have changed, or their own internal passion might have changed. How do you recommend entrepreneurs should connect to that passion, that purpose, or realign to their new passion or purpose?
Yeah, I mean, this is also a great question, and it's something that I think about often myself. And I think that maybe the answer I'm going to give you is a bit sort of untraditional here, because here's the bottom line. What I feel like we're constantly looking and searching for outside things to make sure that we are okay on the inside. It's purpose. I'm looking for purpose. And if I find this purpose, I'm going to be good, and I'm going to be full of energy, and I'm going to be happy, and I'm going to, create with so much more passion or whatever. Or oh, I found my purpose. I'm in my purpose and I'm doing great and blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden, a year and a half later, I'm a little bit, uh, you know, not motivated anymore. And so do I have to refine my purpose? Is it because my purpose changed, or is it a new mission? So I feel like we're constantly going through this thing that ultimately what we're doing is we're trying to find this thing, whether it is a purpose, mission, or a partner or a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a new place to live or whatever it is, to sort of live life with vigor and shakti and prana and all of these things. And frankly, I think that that's not really the answer. I think that we can really find our shakti and our prana and this passion for life, regardless of all that stuff. You could do it while you're in a job that you hate, actually, and that has no purpose and mission for you. You can do that by really looking deep into yourself and doing all kinds of things, whether that's, meditation, connecting to nature, and really connecting to your own essence and life force energy to be like, holy shit, I'm alive. Like I'm on this crazy spinning planet and we have no idea what this whole entire universe thing is. And this is pretty amazing. And I get to play in this thing and create and do amazing things and have fun with it. And things are going to go wrong and things are going to go great. And I'm going to be sad. I'm going to be happy. But one way or another, I'm going to choose to sort of allow this life force to run through me. And that's naturally going to take you into a path of potentially quitting that job that you don't like and isn't full of purpose and passion. But I feel like no matter what, if you approach life that way on a much more spiritual level, I think that that's ultimately, for me at least, is what it comes down to, or what I aim to more and more as I get older, as opposed to trying to find or renew an outside purpose or passion. I feel like that comes naturally if you're finding it inside yourself.
That's such a good point. It starts with within versus outside, and everybody is always seeking that outside validation or that outside thing that will save them, or they'll find their passion, find their purpose. But if they focus on themselves and work on themselves, and it will naturally find them, I feel like, is what you're saying, and that's such a great point. I would love to go back to this part about, marketing, because and finding your voice. I think that's also really important in being a conscious, creator and a conscious business is finding your voice, because sometimes your voice isn't that popular. There's companies that are out there that were doing things differently. I think of like, when I was studying branding, like Tom Shoes back in the day, like when they were like, okay, we're gonna actually have this one for one model. It wasn't like social capitalism wasn't like really big back then. And so like how do you find your voice, and like how do you like really stand firm in that voice in your marketing, even if like the metrics or people aren't really I guess not resonating with it, but they're not fully aligning to it yet. But how do you move forward with your voice and really find it in marketing?
Yeah, and so this whole idea of voice could go for both either brands or individuals, right? I mean, it's actually quite similar, because if you look at brands from a business and marketing standpoint, what you're doing is, so you go in and you sort of create this brand persona, right? And you give this brand a name, an age, like who it would connect with, like who it hangs out with, et cetera, et cetera. You kind of make it a person. So we can even talk about it just in terms of a person or a brand, and it kind of goes equal. I think a lot of it has to do with sort of deciding what that is that really resonates from an authentic standpoint, that allows you to do it over and over again and continuously with truly feeling like, hey, this is actually who I am. So like, for example, for me, part of the reason that I started my podcast a while back now, almost 5 years ago, around this subject of conscious capitalism, which was because I wanted to talk about it in a platform that allowed me to be myself. And myself means like being real, and like I curse, for example, right? And that doesn't make me a non-conscious human. That's just how I talk, right? And so like that platform for me, the podcast platform, allowed me to be myself and speak in a way that I speak truthfully and authentically. And so I feel very comfortable in that. It's allowed me to do it consistently now for, 5 years. I feel like if I would have gone into it in an inauthentic way, I would be burnt out from it, for example. So same way with brands, like there's some brands that do it so well. There's this one brand that's like a cannabis drink brand called Can. And I just see their social media and the way they communicate, and it's so hilarious and it's so funny and it's kind of out there. I think humor is a big thing that I think a lot of brands should or could implement, right? If it is in fact somehow authentically. But ultimately, like, I think that humor is something that we can all connect to. So I think a lot of people can really resonate when brands sort of get a little bit like sort of step back and stop being so freaking serious and laugh a little bit about things, right? I think that humor is a beautiful way to implement into a brand voice of a company, for example. But ultimately, it just comes down to authenticity, and in a way that you're able to do it over and over again, even if you hear crickets. Because I've seen also a lot of this with my friends or people that I follow on social media. I started seeing that all of a sudden, like I was like, oh wow, this person's basically been quiet their whole lives, and all of a sudden they have a voice, right? And they have a style, and I'm pretty sure it feels authentic to me. But there's crickets because nobody's used to hearing them, right? And then they do it over and over and over and over and over and over again. And all of a sudden, they start getting engagement. People start listening. People start asking questions, and they start growing that way. And it was because, in my opinion, because it was truly so authentic to them that it allowed them to consistently put it out there over and over again, even though they hear crickets. And quite frankly, like for me, and just so y'all know, sometimes I get stuff out there in a podcast that's quite successful and it gets wonderful engagement, and I get people that tell me beautiful things, and I post stuff and there's comments and questions and this and that. And sometimes I put stuff out there and I get crickets too. And I've been doing it for a while. So it's also kind of like you have to develop a little bit of thick skin. As long as it's authentic and you're consistent, just go for it.
That's such valuable advice. It's like, because I think people can get really dejected when they don't see results right away. But like you said, if you're authentically you, then, you know, there's nothing stopping you. You just continue to move forward and you continue to move forward, and eventually it will like pop or something will shift and people will start seeing you and hearing your voice. So I think that's very valuable. Max even said unbelievable value in the last 20 minutes. So he's really he's already loving the conversation. I love that as well. Um, since you've been in the space for a while now, I'd love to talk a little bit about, the shifts that you've seen in conscious, business, and what are the trends that are happening? Like, where is it going, and where has it been, and where is it going?
Yeah, it's really something that started happening more so in the originally, I want to say, I don't have the exact data on this, probably like in the 80s and 90s is when companies started sort of shifting this way, when the first companies started coming out with like, oh wow, we can actually, we can build mission and purpose in a business and it can still be good for business. And so as I mentioned a little bit earlier before, it's gotten now to the point that because companies know it's good for business, a lot of them are kind of slapping it on. You're getting the greenwashing, you're getting this inauthentic aspect of it, right? So that's where it's sort of gone from original, building mission in a business in the, sort of 80s, 90s, early thousands to now, oh, wow, this is good for business. So everybody and anybody has to do it, implement some sort of sustainability, have some sort of mission, have some sort of give back, slap it on, market it, whatever. And so I think where it's going is that I think it's going to a place that most brands and businesses are going to have to do it. Like, I think that 20 years from now, we're going to see that today we're in, so for example, for us, a lot of us are in LA and we're in this sort of echo chamber and, sort of circle bubble of mission driven CPG brands, for example, right? You go to the grocery store or you go to like an Air One or a Whole Foods or whatever, and tons of the packaged goods that you're seeing have a mission, have a give back, have some sort of sustainability, have some sort of, do good thing, which I think is amazing. So I think we're in a place where the rest of the country and world, a lot of the world's, Europe's already caught on to that, but we're going to be seeing more and more and more of these brands that have a mission and purpose. And then we're going to see more of the old school brands that are implementing it. So what's next is going to be that deciphering of authenticity, like what's really happening, right? So how is that going to happen? I'm not exactly sure, but I also, there's just so many amazing content creators out there too, that are sort of out there exposing brands and exposing movements that are inauthentic, and others that are telling beautiful stories about the brands and companies that have these amazing missions as well. So I think it's in an inevitable like spot of like it's going to happen more and more and more with businesses, and we're going to have to figure out a way to decipher what's real and what's not, because brands know that it's good for business. So it's happening now, it's going to keep happening, and I don't see it like really turning back.
That's a really great point that you just mentioned right there. Like the brands are gonna have to do it regardless if they want to or not. It's just gonna be part of it, but it's how they do it and how authentic they are. But one question that popped up in my head when you were talking about like people are exposing like brands that are not like working, or people are talking and sharing the stories of other brands is, how do you start to get that word of mouth movement within your brand? Because I think that's important as more people are seeking that authenticity. There's more influencers these days, or even micro influencers on all these platforms. How do you start to, I guess, utilize their voices to support your mission and sharing your message and being your brand advocates. Because I don't think we talked a lot about having brand advocates, but I think that's also really important to build into your business.
Yeah, you mentioned, influencers, you mentioned micro influencers and brand advocates. These are all terms that, at my agency, we talk about all the time, and even like with the brands that we work with, right? So we work with a lot of purpose-driven and mission-driven brands, and we're trying to get the word out for them through influencers, through micro influencers, through how do we turn these influencers into actual brand advocates, right? And brand loyalists. That's really where the magic happens, right? You can have a budget, you can go out with a budget, and you can pay people to talk about you, right? That's sort of like the basic, like 101 into influencer marketing, and getting others to talk about you. Now, that can come off as authentic or inauthentic, depending on how they go out and create that message and how they expose the brand for you. The magic lies in, okay, how mission driven really is your brand, and how much does that creator or influencer or micro influencer connect with that mission? If they connect with the mission really well and they really truly believe it, they're most likely going to tell your story in a very authentic and creative way. What people that are listening out there are going to be hearing that story, and they're gonna be more likely to sort of like buy into it and believe it, right? Now, that happens just once. Usually it just kind of gets lost. And that's why what you said about ambassadors comes in and is really important, right? So typically what we aim to do in our marketing campaigns is we try to find the most aligned influencers, micro influencers, creators to the brand that are truly aligned, that we already can see based on what they're talking about, that they're going to align with the mission of the brand. That's already going to be half the battle, because they're going to be introduced to the brand and they're already going to love the brand, because we know that their mission aligns one way or another. Yeah, it doesn't have to be exactly aligned, but like, if they're talking about some form of sustainability and you've got eco-conscious packaging, then great. We know most likely that they're going to love that part of the brand, right? After they start creating content, it's it's seeing who are the ones that are creating the best type of content and most authentically, that are connecting the best with people, and then forming long-term ambassadorships and partnerships with those creators. So the long-term, essentially, partnerships that you have are the ones that are going to give you the most. Because as you very well know, if you're scrolling through your feed and you see an influencer or a creator talk about one thing once, you may pay attention, but if you see them talk about it, once every 2 weeks for the next year, that means that you saw them talk about it now 24 times. There's this old rule of marketing that says you have to see something 7 times before you make a purchasing decision. It's pretty much still true. And so, especially today, because we're so bombarded and there's so much noise. So when you see now a creator that's authentically connecting with the mission of a brand or a company and is talking about it all the time, and they're a true ambassador, now you're way more likely to make a purchasing decision, or at least listen and then go check out that brand and check out that mission.
Yeah, it is really about aligning to the right people and building those long-term relationships. Because I feel like there's so many influencers that are just like promoting this and promoting that, and it's like there's just so much that they're promoting that it's hard to like believe and trust them anymore. And it is really important to go ahead and find the people that will build that loyalty for you. Max said that the Grateful Giraffes could be a stamp of trust. We could develop a process for evaluating brands and authenticity. Yeah, that's a good idea. And then Rachel asks, what's happening in person with conscious branding and human connection beyond the online content? There's so much content, it can become daunting when 87 brands are doing the similar thing and they hit your feed.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. That's a great question. So, for example, last week, we hosted an event in Venice at the Kin, actually, with Conscious Capitalism Los Angeles in partnership with my podcast. And we did a panel of 4 leaders from mission-driven brands. We talked about sustainability. Is also an event where people were essentially connecting in their community, people that, most likely if they showed up to that event, is because they cared about it, right? They're interested in it. So there's those types of events, right? Obviously, Grateful Giraffes is very much a community forward, group. And so I think it really comes down to, doing a little bit of research and finding out and how, like, who do I want to be connecting? What are these brands that are doing community? I think more and more we're seeing brands that are doing more community-based things. And I think this is essentially thanks to the pandemic, because I feel like post-pandemic, everybody craved it so much that more and more it's just like part of what brands are doing. For example, on that panel, I had the head of experiential marketing at Rivian, right? So Rivian is an electric vehicle company, and they do so much in terms of these sort of experiential community-based events to foster human connection. And one of the things that he was talking about was that he was surprised to see what happens when you sort of provide an environment for people and then let them take over, right? And so they were shocked to see how many of these actual in-person communities were taking these experiential events and forming like clubs from it, and then forming meetups from it, and sort of taking that beyond. And they were all people that were very much caring about, they loved their sort of EVs and eco-conscious vehicles, and it was all about sort of like exploring nature and hiking and being connected to nature and doing it in a sustainable way when they're driving, et cetera, right? So it was sort of like an example of taking that into an actual human experience and then allowing humans to kind of do their own thing with it. So I think that's a good example. But yeah, and ultimately it's sort of, what else did you say on there? You said so much content can become daunting when 87 brands are doing this. Yeah, exactly. So I think that in general, not a ton of brands are taking it to the in-person community type of events. So I think that in-person community events, even if they start small, are super important and are really making people feel connected.
Yeah, I also feel that way too, because there's such a different level of connection when you can see the other persons, can see the ambassadors or the brand people, and like talk to them and have a community of like-minded people. I think just it goes back to like the word of mouth and the experience, like you mentioned. I would love to go into like some examples of like conscious companies that have done a really great job of, putting themselves out there, creating brand advocates, creating like a movement. I know this is not necessarily a conscious company, but I feel like, like Stanley Cups, it went from like the small company, there's like all these case studies on it, and then it became like this big company because they aligned to a certain demographic who like is now has like 20 Stanley Cups at home, when it was like more male dominated. But like, have you seen like a conscious brand that has created that shift, that momentum, that movement forward, and done it really well? And can you share a little bit about what they did?
Yeah, the most sort of classic example of a conscious brand is going to be Patagonia, right? They're obviously they're massive, so sometimes it's hard for us to sort of relate to it. But you have a company that truly has this mission of not wanting you to constantly buy more of their jackets. They want you to buy really just one jacket, and they want it to work, right? And they have certain, and I don't know like all of their exact policies, but they have all kinds of ways for you to really just want to be able to just wear that jacket pretty much forever. They do everything when it comes to like commitment to ethical manufacturing, sustainable materials, and then they have so much when it comes to environmental stewardship, right? So they've done so much, and they've really essentially put their money where their mouth is, to where that's sort of this like staple, ideal, conscious brand per se. You mentioned Tom's earlier. Tom's was actually, that was one of the first books that I had read on the subject, because Blake, the founder, the original founder of Tom's, sort of created that one-for-one model. Now, I think that they're a great example of a company that started doing something. There's a lot of evidence out there and kind of data that says that doing a one-for-one model isn't necessarily the most conscious thing. And then sort of like some challenges came from that by just going out and just donating tons of shoes in places where, there's this whole thing about it. There's pros and cons to it, but I still think that doing something is better than doing nothing. But that was one of the kind of like the original brands that was doing it. There are so many brands that are doing this out there today. So for example, Homeboy Industries is a brand out of LA that originally they're kind of like their whole thing was employing ex-convicts or people that had been in jail. So essentially what they were doing is, from a social impact standpoint, they were giving sort of this quote unquote second chances to people that typically have a very hard and difficult time getting a job. So they were giving all these people that have been in jail jobs. And they had different parts of Homeboy Industries, right? So Homeboy makes, like, if you go to the grocery store today in LA, you could see that they have salsas, for example. So there was this sub brand of like salsas and food, and so you have all of these people making these salsas and things like that, and they were using like organic ingredients, et cetera, right? Then there was a Homeboy Threads, for example, and Homeboy Threads is another subdivision of Homeboy Industries that gets all of these pre-incarcerated people that are working on the job, and they're helping other brands going through like not just like reusing and upcycling and choosing the right threads and things like that. Because, for example, for clothing is one of the most, it's like one of the dirtiest sort of most unconscious industries out there in terms of the dyes and the waste and all kinds of things that happen. So then you have big companies that manufacture a lot of clothes that go consult with somebody like Homeboy Threads on the types of materials that they're using, how to reuse it, how to sort of like maximize it and things like that. Another company that's doing that right now is Macher, Macher. For example, what they do is they work with tons of other companies on their promotional items and swag. Swag and promotional is one of the, again, another massively dirty industry. You go to a trade show, you go to a convention, and you get all this swag that you end up not using or throwing away. So they're kind of like revolutionizing that industry. How are we using it in terms of like, being conscious with the materials and recycling and all these things and not using plastic, but also looking at, okay, are you actually getting ROI from the swag and these promotions that you're giving to people? Or are they just being wasted, right? So it's like, how can we give promotional products to the people that are going to your trade show in a way that's they're actually going to be used and you're getting ROI on it, and we're using the right materials and all these things. So those are just sort of a few examples of some companies that are doing it out there in a big way.
Those are such great examples, and it prompted another question that came up. Like, first, there's like a couple parts to this question. So first, like Patagonia, like their mission is like, only like environment, so they don't want you like to over purchase and over consume. But how do you balance that with profits as well too? Because at the end of the day, you also need people to buy your items in order to sustain yourself to move forward with the mission. And what you brought up with Tom's was really important as well too, is like like there comes to a point where what you're doing is actually not helping, and then how do you start to like reconcile that, because you are wanting to be a conscious business. So I'm just trying to like figure out, how do you blend these two together, where it's like, where's like the sweet spot, I guess. I feel like Homeboys, like you mentioned, is doing a really good job because it's more like a social enterprise, and they are giving jobs to people that are incarcerated, and like they're actually like, food is consumable, so like it's not really wasteful as like the clothing industry. But like, how do you find that sweet spot, that part where it's like you do good and you still get the profits, but you're also not creating or perpetuating an even greater problem?
Yeah, it's a challenge, right? I don't think that that's something that's actually easy. I think ultimately, right, as I mentioned earlier, you do have to still focus on profits and ROI, which means you have to be efficient, you have to be lean, right? You have to figure out ways to be innovative with your sourcing, right? You have to not have waste, right? Waste in every aspect, right? You can't, like, if you are making clothes, you can't have all of this extra clothes that wasn't used that season, for example, or something like that, right? So, for example, with Patagonia, you have these staple items that have been used for 20 years now, right? Where you have, sure, there's a few like model changes and things like that, but for example, it's the opposite of like an H&M that has, I think that there's something like these fast fashion companies, most of them consider that they have like 52 seasons in a year, quote unquote. And what that means is that every week can be considered a season, because every week there's something new that comes out in terms of a style that comes out. And what that does is it just creates so much waste of clothes, because once it's out of style or out of season or whatever, they're not reselling it anymore, right? And they got all this extra inventory, and now they're going out and either they have to get rid of it or selling it at like a discount, and then that goes all over the place, and it creates all this type of waste. So there has to be sort of this way of like not generating and creating waste, right? That's a big thing, right? Like not overproducing things that you're not going to sell. And that could come from things like on-demand type buying. More and more, we now see brands that, like, if you're buying online, you can be buying like not from necessarily some sort of a massive stock that they have. Like there's stuff that's essentially being, created for you as you're buying it, or they have very, very little inventory. For example, we have a great brand that we've been working with for a long time. It's called First Light Farms. And this is actually a grass-fed, grass-finished Wagyu beef company from New Zealand. And they work with all kinds of different co-ops and farmers that are raising, cattle in a sustainable way, that they're being treated properly, they're eating grass, they're not stressed, and they're also doing it in regenerative ways, right? So constantly, if you're trying to go on to the website sometimes and buy certain, high marble steak, whatever specific steak you're trying to look for, many times it's sold out. A lot of times it's sold out. And somebody may be like, that's so bad for business. How could you be sold out? Well, because there's only so much that you can create, right? If you're doing it the right way, there's only so much to go around. So it's not about creating mass amounts and selling mass amounts. It's like, what is actually being needed in terms of being bought and sold. So I think that sort of reducing that waste is huge in that sense. Just being essentially innovative, right? Like you have to innovate no matter what business you're in. You're constantly having to innovate, right? So it's this thing where you can't sit behind, and just because you have like a cute or pretty or amazing mission or vision doesn't mean that you don't have to innovate, right? So like if I'm Patagonia and I've got, this amazing brand with this beautiful mission around sustainability, and I've got this great jacket, like the jacket still has to be just as useful or more than the other non-sustainable jackets. Well, based on its functionality, it's got to have just as much comfort. It's got to have the best pockets. It's got to repel water just as much if I'm going hiking. So innovation is huge, right? So I feel like reducing waste, but you still have to innovate as much as possible, and you still have to stay lean, right? You can't just like overemploy people because you've got some sort of nice funding at the moment, right? It's staying lean, it's innovating, and I think those are like two key things about sort of staying alive and making sure that the profits are still there ultimately. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to employ people, and you're not going to be able to keep that mission moving forward.
Wow, that was really good. Like that, what you just said there, I think it highlights so many points that we have to think about. And it's not just being conscious of like environment or anything, but it's conscious of the way that you're doing business, and being very intentional about each part of the business to make sure that it stays from this conscious place. Like, what is my true impact, and how am I actually serving? Is what I'm putting forward as my product really not just supporting a cause that I care about, but actually also supporting all these other pieces like the environment or whatever else. So I think that was such a beautiful point that you mentioned there. And Rachel says, love the idea that less is more, because we don't really need more. But like you said, if we can innovate and do better so that we don't need as much, then maybe like that can shift things. So yeah, I was just like, oh, I love the way that you put it all together. What advice would you have for somebody that is starting out on this journey to create a conscious business? I'm even thinking of like, the Grateful Giraffes, as we're still in our early stages. Like, what is like a founder or like somebody who wants to create this change, what advice would you give them to make the step towards creating a fully conscious business, and building that conscious business?
Yeah, I think you have to really sort of look deep and figure out like, what do you really care about, right? So is there really something that you care about? Is there a mission that you can get behind, like an existing mission perhaps that you want to get behind and help feed and help improve and kind of move forward? Or is it a new thing or a new problem that you see that others don't, that you really want to solve? You still have to solve a problem. Like no matter what, you have to solve a problem, both from if there's a mission there's sort of a problem that you're trying to solve in the world, perhaps community, environment, whatever that may be. But then you also have to solve a problem to the consumer. If you're not solving a really good problem to the consumer at, doing it well, then you're also not going to have a business. So I think you have to figure out, like, am I really solving a problem? And how much do I really care about this problem that I'm solving? I think it's quite simple. I mean, quite simple. I mean, in terms of the questions that you should be asking, what do I really care about? Is there something that I really want to get behind? And how am I solving a problem? I think that's a really good place to start, because I think a lot of the times we think that we can make something pretty from a branding standpoint or a marketing standpoint, and we think it's going to sell. But is it really solving something? Is this also really tied to a mission that I really, really care about? Because if I really, really care about it, I'm going to be a lot more motivated to keep going at it. And if it's really solving a problem, I'm convinced that ultimately people will see that value and buy it.
Yeah, you're right. At the end of the day, like we have to solve problems because that's how people buy as well too. And from the storytelling, it's like, but they have to see that there is a problem to buy the thing that you're talking about. I think that's such a good point. Um, how would, somebody like find out more about conscious business? Like where do you start? I know your podcast, we can talk a little bit about your podcast, but like where should people start to research if they want to find out more about this movement, bringing consciousness to business and bringing that together and bridging that gap?
Yeah, thank you, man. Definitely, like, in terms of myself, yeah, just come find me on social media. If you just search my name, really, Sebastian Naum, on any of the podcast platforms, you can find the podcast. There's a lot on there. I've interviewed a lot of conscious and intentional leaders and different movements. So there's a lot you can find out, definitely on the podcast. In terms of movement itself, I'm part of the board of Conscious Capitalism, which is a worldwide organization. I'm on the board of the LA chapter. Definitely, that's a movement that aims to educate as much as possible about this whole idea of mission-driven business. Yeah, I mean, these are two great resources. Ultimately, just go out and maybe GPT some great books on the subject, and maybe read something that may inspire you, or look up some conscious leaders that are doing it in a big way. Go out and look up maybe the story of the founder of Patagonia, for example, and like get inspired that way. There's so many different things you could do in there. There's so much out there nowadays in terms of this aspect of consciousness and business, that I find it very inspiring. And as we said earlier too, is sort of make sure that you're at least starting out with a very much a vetted movement or company or leader, so that you really get that a very authentic one, so you're not kind of falling into the greenwashing that we were talking about. So yeah, I'd love for you to come join me. Find me on Instagram, Seb Nam. But yeah, if you just search my name, and I'm happy to share any further resources with you to sort of get inspired and started with this stuff.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk. I think I can speak for everybody that's on here, like that we've learned so much about this movement, and really thinking about business in a different way, and allowing us to build a business that is more impactful. And really want to thank you for your time and all your work that you're doing to spread, consciousness onto this planet through business. And I think that's so important and so needed as humanity wakes up and humanity becomes more conscious. You're really at the forefront. So thank you for all the work that you do. Thank you for all of your heart and soul that you're pouring into this, and we just really appreciate you for being on today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you, Min, and I appreciate the Grateful Giraffes and the community, and for having me on, and also for wanting to have this conversation. I think it's an important conversation. I think that we think about, I like to think about business and spirituality a lot of the times together. I think that that's a concept that may be a little bit gnarly for some people in terms of like, what do you mean? And I do think that business can very much be spiritual, and it has to do with sort of everything that we were just talking about, right? A greater mission, a greater purpose for our communities, for our people, for our planet, and mixing that into business. I think that this is truly the way for us to move forward and to elevate our consciousnesses for humanity. So thank you again for having me. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being
I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you like the show, please subscribe or share with a homie. It means the world to me. And honestly, straight up, just hit me up. The easiest way on Instagram, SEBNAUM. Ask me questions. I want to be here as a resource and a source of inspiration. I hope you have a beautiful rest of the day. Much love.